You're embarrassing the entire family with this divorce nonsense, Victoria. Military wives are supposed to endure, not abandon ship when things get difficult." The words sliced through the Sunday dinner conversation like shrapnel, delivered by my sister-in-law Patricia with the precision of a trained sniper. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that I owned the very ground beneath the military installation where my soon-to-be ex-husband commanded his battalion, and I was about to remind them exactly what abandoning ship actually looked like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Sterling, and 6 months ago, I believed I understood the meaning of loyalty, sacrifice, and family support. I had spent 12 years as a military spouse, following my husband Colonel James Morrison from base to base, rebuilding our life with each reassignment, and maintaining the perfect facade of the devoted officer's wife. I had organized charity events for military families, managed household relocations across 4 states, and smiled graciously through countless formal dinners where conversations revolved around deployment schedules and promotion prospects. The Sterling family had always viewed my marriage to James as a strategic alliance. My father, General Robert Sterling, had served 35 years before retirement, and my marriage to a rising officer was seen as continuing the family's military legacy. My mother, Eleanor, had spent decades perfecting the art of military social protocols, and she expected me to follow the same prescribed path of silent support and unwavering dedication. For 12 years, I had fulfilled those expectations flawlessly. I had endured James's 18-month deployment to Afghanistan, managing our household and his career correspondence while he focused on combat operations. I had relocated to Fort Braxton in North Carolina when he received his promotion to base commander, leaving behind friendships and professional opportunities to support his advancement. I had hosted dinner parties for visiting dignitaries, organized spouse support groups during subsequent deployments, and maintained the impeccable public image that military leadership demanded. What my family did not understand, what they had never bothered to learn, was that my sacrifices had been strategic rather than merely dutiful. While James focused on military operations and career advancement, I had been building something far more substantial than a traditional marriage. 3 years earlier, when we learned that Fort Braxton was facing potential closure due to federal budget constraints, I had recognized an opportunity that my military training had prepared me to seize. My background was not limited to the traditional military spouse role that my family assumed. Before marriage, I had earned a master's degree in strategic communications from Georgetown University and had spent 4 years working in defense contracting, specializing in government relations and procurement processes. My father had encouraged this education as preparation for supporting a military husband's career, never imagining that I might use these skills for independent purposes. When the base closure threat emerged, I had approached the situation with the same analytical mindset that had served me in defense contracting. I researched the federal land disposition process, studied previous base closure procedures, and identified the specific mechanisms through which military property transitioned to civilian control. What I discovered was that Fort Braxton sat on 12,000 acres of strategically valuable land, adjacent to major transportation corridors, and positioned within 50 miles of 3 major metropolitan areas. The federal government had established procedures for disposing of surplus military property, including provisions for private purchase by qualified entities under specific circumstances. The process was complex, requiring extensive documentation, financial qualifications, and strategic partnerships with local development authorities. Most importantly, it required someone with both the expertise to navigate federal bureaucracy and the financial resources to execute a large-scale land acquisition. I had spent 18 months developing relationships with regional development firms, securing preliminary financing commitments, and preparing the necessary documentation for a private land acquisition bid. The process required absolute discretion, as any premature disclosure could result in competing bids or political interference that might compromise the entire project. James had been aware of my interest in real estate development but had dismissed it as a hobby that helped me manage the isolation of military life. My family had been similarly dismissive. During our monthly family dinners, my mother would ask politely about my little projects, while clearly viewing them as pleasant distractions from my primary role as a military wife. My father would nod approvingly when I mentioned working with local business leaders, assuming that I was building social connections that might benefit James's career rather than developing independent professional relationships. Patricia, James's sister, had always viewed my marriage to her brother as an achievement that elevated her family's social status. She frequently reminded others that her brother commanded a major military installation, and she used our family connection to establish credibility in her own social circles. Her husband, Robert, worked in mid-level corporate management and clearly appreciated the reflected prestige of having a military commander as a brother-in-law. The deterioration of my marriage had begun subtly, emerging through accumulated resentments and diverging priorities rather than dramatic conflicts. James had returned from his most recent deployment changed, more distant, and increasingly focused on career advancement opportunities that would require additional relocations and extended separations. Our conversations had gradually shifted from partnership discussions to logistical updates about household management and social obligations. The breaking point had occurred 3 months earlier during a formal dinner party I had organized for visiting Pentagon officials. James had publicly dismissed my observations about regional economic development opportunities, describing my interests as civilian concerns that were outside my understanding. The comment had been delivered with the casual condescension that had become increasingly common in our private conversations, but its public nature had represented a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamics. I had recognized in that moment that James viewed my contributions to our partnership as auxiliary rather than essential, despite the fact that my strategic planning and social coordination had directly supported his career advancement for over a decade. His promotion to base commander had been facilitated by my relationships with local political leaders and business communities, connections that had demonstrated his ability to manage civilian-military cooperation effectively. The decision to pursue divorce had not been impulsive but rather the logical conclusion of careful analysis. I had recognized that James's career ambitions would continue to require my subordination of independent goals, while my own professional development had created opportunities that demanded focused attention and strategic risk-taking. The land acquisition project represented the culmination of years of preparation, and its success required my complete commitment during a critical implementation period. I had filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning in March, delivering the papers to James at his office on base. His reaction had been immediate and predictable, expressing shock at my timing and concern about the potential impact on his career. His primary focus had been on managing the public relations aspects of our separation, rather than addressing the underlying relationship issues that had created the situation. The family reaction had been swift and unanimous in its disapproval. My mother had called within hours of James informing my father about the divorce proceedings, expressing her disappointment in my decision to abandon my marriage during a challenging period. My father had been more direct, questioning my judgment and suggesting that I was allowing temporary difficulties to override long-term family obligations. Patricia had been the most vocal critic, organizing family gatherings that were clearly designed to pressure me into reconsidering the divorce. She had enlisted other family members to express concern about my decision, creating a coordinated campaign of emotional manipulation disguised as loving intervention. Her husband Robert had contributed by questioning my financial stability and suggesting that I was making an emotional decision that would result in long-term practical difficulties. The Sunday dinner where Patricia delivered her assessment of my character had been the culmination of months of this campaign. The gathering had included my parents, Patricia and Robert, and my younger brother Michael, who had recently completed his military service and was beginning a civilian career. The conversation had been orchestrated to present my divorce as evidence of character weakness and family disloyalty. Patricia had begun by discussing the challenges facing military families in the current political environment, emphasizing the importance of maintaining stability and presenting united fronts against external pressures. She had transitioned to specific criticism of military spouses who abandon their duty during difficult periods, making clear that her comments were directed at my situation, while maintaining plausible deniability about personal attacks. The culminating moment had arrived when Patricia directly addressed my decision to divorce James, describing it as an embarrassment to the family and a betrayal of military values. Her statement about military wives being expected to endure rather than abandon ship had been delivered with the authority of someone who had never faced comparable challenges but felt qualified to judge those who had. My response had been measured and strategic. Rather than engaging in emotional arguments about marriage or family loyalty, I had simply stated that I was confident in my decision, and that time would demonstrate its wisdom. The comment had been dismissed by family members as defensive posturing, and the conversation had moved to other topics with the assumption that continued pressure would eventually restore my compliance with family expectations. What none of them understood was that my confidence was based on concrete developments, rather than emotional conviction. The land acquisition project had reached its final stages, with federal approval processes nearing completion and financing arrangements confirmed. Within 60 days, I would own the land beneath Fort Braxton, including the residential areas where James lived and worked, the administrative buildings where he conducted daily operations, and the training facilities that housed his battalion. The irony was exquisite. My family had criticized my divorce as evidence of disloyalty and abandonment, while simultaneously assuming that I would require their financial and emotional support to manage the transition to independent living. They had failed to recognize that my years of strategic planning and professional development had created opportunities that exceeded anything available through traditional military spouse roles. My mother had offered to help me find suitable housing near my parents' home, assuming that I would need family assistance to establish financial stability. My father had suggested that I might consider returning to school to develop practical skills for civilian employment, apparently forgetting my advanced education and professional background. Patricia had volunteered to help me understand the realities of single life, despite her own complete dependence on her husband's income and social connections. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The condescension had been comprehensive and systematic, reflecting their genuine belief that my decision to divorce represented emotional instability rather than strategic planning. They had interpreted my calm demeanor during family confrontations as evidence of denial rather than confidence, and they had assumed that reality would eventually force me to acknowledge my mistakes and seek their guidance. The base closure announcement had been delayed for political reasons, allowing me additional time to complete the land acquisition process without external complications. James remained unaware of my involvement in the private development consortium that would assume control of Fort Braxton property, as the legal documents identified the purchasing entity through corporate structures that obscured individual ownership details. My attorney, Margaret Chen, had specialized in government contract law for 15 years, and had guided me through the complex federal procedures with expertise that ensured compliance while maintaining confidentiality. The financial arrangements involved partnerships with regional development firms that provided both capital and expertise for large-scale land development projects, with ownership structures that gave me controlling interests while distributing operational responsibilities among qualified partners. The strategic value of the Fort Braxton property extended far beyond its current military applications. The location provided access to major transportation networks, including interstate highways, railway connections, and proximity to regional airports. The existing infrastructure included power systems, telecommunications networks, and water treatment facilities that could support substantial civilian development projects. The land itself was zoned for mixed-use development, allowing for residential, commercial, and light industrial applications. Regional economic development authorities had identified the Fort Braxton area as a priority location for attracting technology companies and advanced manufacturing operations. The proximity to major universities provided access to educated workforce populations, while the existing infrastructure reduced development costs for companies considering relocation or expansion. My partnerships with local development firms had been structured to capitalize on these regional advantages while maintaining my controlling ownership position. The timeline for base closure had been extended to allow for orderly transition of military operations, providing an 18-month window between the formal closure announcement and the final transfer of property ownership. This extended timeline had created opportunities for advanced planning of civilian development projects, allowing potential tenants and buyers to begin negotiations before the property officially entered the private market. My role in orchestrating this transition had required skills and expertise that my family had never recognized or valued, The strategic planning, relationship building, and financial coordination involved in large-scale land acquisition projects demanded capabilities that extended far beyond traditional military spouse responsibilities. Yet their continued condescension suggested that they viewed my professional accomplishments as irrelevant to my personal decision-making abilities. The divorce proceedings had progressed smoothly, with James focused primarily on protecting his military career from potential scandal, rather than fighting over financial arrangements. His assumption that I would require spousal support had simplified negotiations, as he had been eager to establish reasonable support payments in exchange for my agreement to maintain discretion about the reasons for our separation. What James had not realized was that my financial independence was already secured through the land acquisition project, making spousal support unnecessary, but strategically useful for maintaining the appearance of traditional post-divorce financial arrangements. His willingness to provide generous support had reinforced his assumption that I was dependent on his continued goodwill, while actually providing additional resources for my ongoing business development activities. The approaching revelation of my land ownership would fundamentally alter every relationship dynamic within my family structure. Patricia's condescending remarks about military wives and family embarrassment would be recontextualized when she learned that I owned the property where her brother served. My parents' concerns about my financial stability would be rendered obsolete when they discovered the scope of my business partnerships and land holdings. Most significantly, James's position as base commander would be complicated by the reality that his ex-wife controlled the land beneath his command, creating unprecedented personal and professional challenges that would require careful navigation to avoid career damage. The Sunday dinner conversation had concluded with family members expressing hope that I would reconsider my divorce decision and work toward reconciliation with James. Patricia had offered to facilitate conversations between us, assuming that my independence was temporary rather than permanent. My mother had suggested that marriage counseling might help us address whatever difficulties had created our current separation. I had listened to these suggestions with appropriate courtesy while recognizing that they were based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about my situation and motivations. The land acquisition project represented years of strategic planning and professional development that had prepared me for exactly this type of transition. Rather than requiring family support or guidance, I was positioned to demonstrate that my decision-making had been based on opportunities and capabilities that they had never recognized. The following weeks would bring a series of revelations that would systematically challenge every assumption my family had made about my divorce, my financial situation, and my strategic capabilities. The base closure announcement would create the first shock, followed by the disclosure of private land acquisition activities, and ultimately the revelation of my controlling ownership position. Each revelation would force my family to reconsider their assessment of my judgment and capabilities. Patricia's comments about military wives abandoning ship would be revealed as particularly ironic, given that I had actually acquired the ship rather than abandoning it. My parents' concerns about my ability to manage independent living would be superseded by recognition that I had developed business relationships and financial resources that exceeded their own achievements. The transformation from dismissed military spouse to major landowner would demonstrate the consequences of underestimating someone's capabilities based on traditional role expectations. My family had assumed that 12 years of military marriage had prepared me only for continued dependence on male authority figures, failing to recognize that the same period had provided opportunities for strategic education, relationship building, and professional development that had created genuine independence. The story that would unfold over the following months would challenge fundamental assumptions about power, loyalty, and family dynamics. My decision to divorce James had been characterized as abandonment and disloyalty, but the land acquisition project would demonstrate that true loyalty sometimes requires independent action rather than passive support. The military values that my family claimed to represent included strategic thinking, tactical planning, and mission accomplishment under challenging circumstances. My orchestration of the land acquisition project had required exactly these capabilities, applied to civilian objectives rather than military operations. The irony was that I had demonstrated military values more effectively through independent strategic planning than through traditional spouse support roles. As I sat at that Sunday dinner table, listening to Patricia's lecture about military wives and family embarrassment, I had recognized that the conversation represented the final chapter of one phase of my life and the beginning of another. The land acquisition project was approaching completion, the divorce proceedings were progressing smoothly, and the stage was set for a series of revelations that would fundamentally alter every relationship in my extended family network. The moment had arrived for my family to learn that their assumptions about my capabilities, my financial situation, and my strategic planning had been comprehensively incorrect. Rather than requiring their support and guidance, I was positioned to demonstrate that respectful independence creates opportunities that traditional dependency relationships cannot provide. The military base they had assumed would provide James with continued career advancement and family prestige would soon become my private property, creating a reversal of power dynamics that would require everyone to reconsider their previous assessments. The woman they had dismissed as emotionally unstable and financially vulnerable would be revealed as a strategic planner, whose careful preparation had created opportunities that exceeded their collective achievements. The transformation was about to begin, and Patricia's comments about abandoning ship would prove to be the final ironic commentary before reality demonstrated who had actually been planning the voyage all along. The pattern had been established long before I recognized it existed. Sitting in my study 3 days after Patricia's dismissive commentary about military wives, I found myself examining a collection of documents that told the story of 12 years spent building something far more substantial than a traditional marriage. The federal land acquisition contracts, partnership agreements, and financial projections spread across my desk represented the culmination of strategic thinking that had begun during my first year as James's wife, though I had not understood its significance at the time. My transformation from compliant military spouse to independent strategic planner had not occurred through sudden revelation but through accumulated observations about power, respect, and the difference between genuine partnership and performative submission. The evidence had been building for years in conversations, decisions, and family interactions that had gradually revealed the true nature of the relationships I had been maintaining. The Sterling family had always operated according to clearly defined hierarchical structures that reflected military organizational principles applied to civilian relationships. My father, General Robert Sterling, had commanded respect through rank and achievement during his active service, and he had expected similar deference within family structures after retirement. My mother, Eleanor, had supported his career through traditional military spouse roles, managing household operations and social obligations, while subordinating her own professional interests to his advancement requirements. This established pattern had created expectations for my own marriage that were never explicitly stated but were consistently reinforced through family interactions and commentary. When I had announced my engagement to James Morrison, then a major with promising career prospects, the family response had focused on the strategic advantages of the alliance rather than questions about personal compatibility or shared values. My father had approved of James's military record and leadership potential, while my mother had praised my selection of a partner who would provide opportunities for continued connection to military community structures. The early years of marriage had seemed to validate these family expectations. James had received promotions on schedule, and we had navigated the relocations and deployments that characterized military careers with apparent success. I had fulfilled the expected roles of military spouse, participating in family readiness groups, organizing social events for officer families, and maintaining household stability during James's extended absences. Yet even during this period of apparent compliance, I had been developing capabilities and relationships that extended beyond traditional spouse responsibilities. My Georgetown education in strategic communications had provided analytical frameworks for understanding organizational dynamics and decision-making processes. My pre-marriage experience in defense contracting had created professional networks and expertise that remained relevant, despite my focus on supporting James's career. The first indication that our marriage operated according to different assumptions than I had recognized occurred during James's promotion to lieutenant colonel and our subsequent relocation to Fort Braxton. The move had required complex coordination of household goods, temporary lodging, and integration into new community structures. I had managed these logistics efficiently while also researching regional economic conditions, local business networks, and development opportunities that might provide professional engagement during our assignment. When I had shared my observations about regional development potential with James, his response had revealed fundamental disconnects in our partnership understanding. Rather than viewing my analysis as valuable strategic input, he had characterized my interests as personal hobbies that should not interfere with military community obligations. His dismissal had been delivered with casual authority that suggested he viewed my professional capabilities as auxiliary to our shared objectives, rather than essential components of our partnership. This response had prompted me to examine other instances where my contributions had been minimized or redirected toward supporting James's priorities, rather than being valued as independent achievements. During his deployment to Afghanistan, I had maintained correspondence with key military and civilian officials who required regular updates about base operations and community relations. The relationships I had developed with these officials had provided James with valuable intelligence about political dynamics and resource availability that had directly contributed to his mission success. Yet when James had received commendations for his deployment performance, the acknowledgments had focused exclusively on his operational leadership, rather than recognizing the strategic communication support that had enabled his effectiveness. My role had been mentioned only in passing references to family stability and spouse support, despite the fact that my professional background had been essential for managing the complex stakeholder relationships that had facilitated his success. Similar patterns had emerged in our social interactions within military communities. During formal events and family gatherings, I had often provided strategic insights about political developments, resource allocation decisions, and personnel changes that affected our community. These contributions had been consistently reframed by James and other military leaders as evidence of my dedication to supporting their activities, rather than recognition of my independent analytical capabilities. The accumulation of these experiences had gradually shifted my understanding of our marriage from genuine partnership toward a more transactional relationship, where my capabilities were valued primarily for their utility in advancing James's career objectives. This recognition had not created immediate conflict, but it had prompted me to begin developing independent professional relationships and strategic objectives that would provide alternatives to continued subordination of my goals to his advancement requirements. The opportunity to develop these alternatives had emerged through my involvement in regional business organizations and economic development initiatives. Fort Braxton's location within a growing metropolitan region had created natural connections between military and civilian leadership communities, and my background in defense contracting had provided credibility for participation in discussions about regional development strategies. Through these professional relationships, I had learned about federal procedures for disposing of surplus military property and the opportunities available for private acquisition of strategic real estate assets. The initial information had been presented as general background about government contracting processes, but I had recognized its potential relevance to Fort Braxton's situation given ongoing discussions about military budget constraints and base consolidation requirements. My decision to investigate land acquisition opportunities had been motivated initially by intellectual curiosity rather than specific strategic objectives. The federal procedures were complex and required specialized expertise, making them an interesting challenge for someone with my background in government relations and procurement processes. The financial requirements were substantial, demanding creative approaches to partnership development and capital formation that would test my professional capabilities. As my research had progressed, I had discovered that Fort Braxton possessed characteristics that made it exceptionally valuable for civilian development purposes. The existing infrastructure had been designed to support large-scale operations, including power systems, telecommunications networks, and transportation access, that would be expensive to replicate in other locations. The surrounding region was experiencing significant population growth and economic development that created demand for additional commercial and residential facilities. More importantly, I had identified specific federal programs that provided opportunities for private acquisition of military property under circumstances that matched Fort Braxton's situation. The base had been included in preliminary discussions about potential closures due to budget constraints, making it eligible for the disposition procedures that I had been researching. The timeline for these procedures typically required 18 to 24 months, providing sufficient opportunity for strategic planning and partnership development. The recognition that I possessed both the expertise and the opportunity to acquire Fort Braxton had transformed my approach to our marriage and family relationships. Rather than continuing to subordinate my professional development to James's career requirements, I had begun developing independent strategic objectives that would provide genuine alternatives to traditional military spouse roles. This shift had required careful management of multiple relationships and competing priorities. James had needed to remain unaware of my land acquisition activities to prevent potential conflicts of interest or career complications. My family had needed to continue viewing me as a conventional military spouse to avoid premature disclosure of my strategic planning. Professional partners and advisors had needed to understand my capabilities and objectives without having access to information that might compromise the confidential nature of my project. The complexity of maintaining these different relationship dynamics had demanded skills in strategic communication, stakeholder management, and operational security that directly paralleled military planning processes. The irony had not been lost on me that I was applying military strategic principles more effectively in civilian business development than James was utilizing in his base command responsibilities. My partnership with Margaret Chen, the attorney specializing in government contract law, had provided the legal expertise necessary for navigating federal land acquisition procedures. Margaret had extensive experience with military property dispositions and had guided previous clients through similar projects, giving her practical knowledge of the regulatory requirements and bureaucratic processes involved in large-scale government real estate transactions. Working with Margaret had required me to articulate my strategic objectives with precision and clarity that would satisfy legal and financial due diligence requirements. The documentation process had demanded comprehensive financial projections, partnership agreements, and regulatory compliance strategies that demonstrated my understanding of both the opportunities and the risks associated with major land acquisition projects. The development of these materials had reinforced my confidence in the analytical and planning capabilities that my family had consistently dismissed as interesting hobbies rather than professional expertise. The federal agencies and private investors who reviewed my proposals had evaluated them according to objective criteria for feasibility, financial viability, and regulatory compliance. Their positive responses had provided external validation of capabilities that my marriage and family relationships had never adequately recognized or valued. My partnerships with regional development firms had required similar demonstrations of strategic thinking and project management expertise. The firms had extensive experience with large-scale real estate development but had limited familiarity with federal property acquisition procedures. My ability to bridge these knowledge gaps while contributing meaningful strategic value had established my credibility as a serious business partner rather than an amateur with inherited military connections. These professional relationships had provided insights into regional economic trends and development opportunities that extended far beyond the immediate Fort Braxton project. The experience had demonstrated that my strategic planning capabilities were transferable to various business contexts, and that my professional network had significant potential for future project development. The financial arrangements for the land acquisition had required creative structuring that balanced my desire for controlling ownership with the practical requirements of large-scale capital formation. My personal resources, while substantial due to careful financial management during 12 years of military marriage, were insufficient for direct property purchase. The solution had involved partnership agreements that provided necessary capital while preserving my decision-making authority and long-term ownership interests. The complexity of these financial arrangements had demanded sophisticated understanding of corporate structures, tax implications, and regulatory requirements that went far beyond traditional personal financial management. Working with financial advisors and partnership attorneys had required me to demonstrate fluency with business concepts and strategic planning processes that would have been challenging for someone without extensive professional experience. Throughout this period of intensive professional development, my family relationships had continued according to established patterns that increasingly felt disconnected from my actual activities and capabilities. Sunday dinners with my parents had featured discussions about military community events, James's career progress, and my apparent contentment with traditional spouse responsibilities. Patricia's commentary about military families and appropriate behavior had reflected assumptions about my priorities and capabilities that were becoming increasingly inaccurate. The disconnect between my public persona and my private strategic activities had created psychological tensions that required careful management. Maintaining appropriate family relationships demanded that I continue demonstrating interest in traditional spouse concerns, while privately developing capabilities and objectives that were fundamentally incompatible with those traditional roles. James's increasing focus on his own career advancement had made this deception easier to maintain. His attention had been primarily directed toward military operations, personnel management, and the political relationships necessary for continued promotion. His assumptions about my activities and interests had been based on established patterns rather than current observation, allowing me to redirect substantial time and energy toward business development without generating questions or concerns. The irony of this situation had become increasingly apparent as my land acquisition project had progressed toward completion. James's success as base commander had been facilitated by the strategic communication and stakeholder relationship management that I had provided throughout our marriage. Yet his assumption that these contributions were natural extensions of spouse support duties had prevented him from recognizing that the same capabilities were being applied to independent strategic objectives that would fundamentally alter our relationship dynamics. My parents' continued expressions of pride in my marriage and family stability had reflected similar assumptions about my priorities and activities. Their view of successful military marriage emphasized loyalty, sacrifice, and subordination of individual interests to family objectives. My apparent fulfillment of these expectations had reinforced their confidence in the family values and strategic decisions that had shaped my upbringing and education. Patricia's regular commentary about military families and appropriate spouse behavior had revealed her investment in maintaining traditional relationship structures that validated her own life choices. Her marriage to Robert had followed conventional patterns where his career advancement provided family financial security, while her activities focused on household management and social obligations. My apparent conformity to similar patterns had supported her assumption that these traditional arrangements represented optimal outcomes for military families. The recognition that my family relationships were based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about my capabilities and objectives had created both opportunities and obligations. The approaching revelation of my land acquisition project would provide dramatic evidence of strategic planning and professional accomplishment that would challenge every assumption they had made about my character and potential. Yet this revelation would also create relationship complications that would require careful management. My parents had invested significant emotional capital in their assessment of my marriage and family choices. Patricia had used my apparent conformity to traditional spouse roles as validation for her own life decisions. James had built his career advancement strategy around assumptions about continued family stability and spouse support that would be fundamentally disrupted by our divorce and my independent business success. The psychological preparation for managing these relationship changes had required me to develop clear understanding of my own motivations and objectives. My decision to pursue land acquisition had not been motivated by desire for revenge or family conflict, but rather by recognition that my professional capabilities were being systematically underutilized within traditional spouse roles. The strategic planning process had demonstrated that I possessed analytical capabilities, relationship-building skills, and project management expertise that could create significant value when applied to appropriate opportunities. The land acquisition project had provided exactly the type of complex, high-stakes challenge that allowed these capabilities to be fully utilized and properly valued. The approaching completion of the project would provide concrete evidence of these capabilities, while creating opportunities for future professional development that would be impossible within traditional military spouse constraints. The financial independence that would result from successful land ownership would eliminate the practical dependencies that had previously limited my strategic options. More importantly, the public recognition of my business success would establish credibility for future professional relationships that would be based on demonstrated performance rather than inherited military community connections. The transformation from military spouse to major landowner would provide foundation for continued professional development that could extend far beyond the immediate Fort Braxton project. The pattern that had been established through 12 years of marriage and family relationships was approaching a fundamental transformation. The family members who had consistently dismissed my professional capabilities were about to discover that their assumptions had been comprehensively incorrect. The husband who had viewed my contributions as auxiliary support was about to learn that his ex-wife owned the property where he served. Most importantly, I was about to demonstrate that strategic independence creates opportunities that traditional dependency relationships cannot provide, and that genuine respect must be earned through demonstrated capability rather than assumed through inherited social positions. The stage was set for revelations that would challenge fundamental assumptions about power, capability, and the true meaning of military values applied to civilian strategic objectives. The revelation of who truly supported my growth versus who benefited from maintaining my subordinate status emerged through a series of carefully orchestrated conversations that occurred during the 2 weeks following Patricia's dismissive commentary about military wives. I had recognized the necessity of conducting a comprehensive assessment of my existing relationships before the land acquisition project reached its final stages, as the successful completion of such a significant undertaking would fundamentally alter every dynamic within my personal and professional networks. My first conversation was with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a clinical psychologist who specialized in military family dynamics and had been providing counseling services to our community for the past 8 years. Sarah had originally been recommended by the Family Readiness Group when I had sought support during James's deployment to Afghanistan, though our relationship had evolved into something more substantial than typical counseling arrangements. Her expertise in organizational psychology and strategic communication had made her a valuable advisor for navigating complex relationship challenges within military communities. During our scheduled appointment at her practice in downtown Raleigh, I had presented Sarah with a carefully structured overview of my situation, including the divorce proceedings, the family reactions, and my strategic planning activities regarding the land acquisition project. The recognition that my family relationships were based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about my capabilities and objectives had created both opportunities and obligations. The approaching revelation of my land acquisition project would provide dramatic evidence of strategic planning and professional accomplishment that would challenge every assumption they had made about my character and potential. Yet this revelation would also create relationship complications that would require careful management. My parents had invested significant emotional capital in their assessment of my marriage and family choices. Patricia had used my apparent conformity to traditional spouse roles as validation for her own life decisions. James had built his career advancement strategy around assumptions about continued family stability and spouse support that would be fundamentally disrupted by our divorce and my independent business success. The psychological preparation for managing these relationship changes had required me to develop clear understanding of my own motivations and objectives. My decision to pursue land acquisition had not been motivated by desire for revenge or family conflict, but rather by recognition that my professional capabilities were being systematically underutilized within traditional spouse roles. The strategic planning process had demonstrated that I possessed analytical capabilities, relationship-building skills, and project management expertise that could create significant value when applied to appropriate opportunities. The land acquisition project had provided exactly the type of complex, high-stakes challenge that allowed these capabilities to be fully utilized and properly valued. The approaching completion of the project would provide concrete evidence of these capabilities, while creating opportunities for future professional development that would be impossible within traditional military spouse constraints. The financial independence that would result from successful land ownership would eliminate the practical dependencies that had previously limited my strategic options. More importantly, the public recognition of my business success would establish credibility for future professional relationships that would be based on demonstrated performance rather than inherited military community connections. The transformation from military spouse to major landowner would provide foundation for continued professional development that could extend far beyond the immediate Fort Braxton project. The pattern that had been established through 12 years of marriage and family relationships was approaching a fundamental transformation. The family members who had consistently dismissed my professional capabilities were about to discover that their assumptions had been comprehensively incorrect. The husband who had viewed my contributions as auxiliary support was about to learn that his ex-wife owned the property where he served. Most importantly, I was about to demonstrate that strategic independence creates opportunities that traditional dependency relationships cannot provide, and that genuine respect must be earned through demonstrated capability rather than assumed through inherited social positions. The stage was set for revelations that would challenge fundamental assumptions about power, capability, and the true meaning of military values applied to civilian strategic objectives. The revelation of who truly supported my growth versus who benefited from maintaining my subordinate status emerged through a series of carefully orchestrated conversations that occurred during the 2 weeks following Patricia's dismissive commentary about military wives. I had recognized the necessity of conducting a comprehensive assessment of my existing relationships before the land acquisition project reached its final stages, as the successful completion of such a significant undertaking would fundamentally alter every dynamic within my personal and professional networks. My first conversation was with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a clinical psychologist who specialized in military family dynamics and had been providing counseling services to our community for the past 8 years. Sarah had originally been recommended by the Family Readiness Group when I had sought support during James's deployment to Afghanistan, though our relationship had evolved into something more substantial than typical counseling arrangements. Her expertise in organizational psychology and strategic communication had made her a valuable advisor for navigating complex relationship challenges within military communities. During our scheduled appointment at her practice in downtown Raleigh, I had presented Sarah with a carefully structured overview of my situation, including the divorce proceedings, the family reactions, and my strategic planning activities regarding the land acquisition project. I had provided sufficient detail for her to understand the scope of my undertaking, while maintaining appropriate confidentiality about specific financial and legal arrangements that were still under development. Sarah's response had been immediately supportive and strategically insightful. She had recognized that my land acquisition project represented sophisticated strategic planning that demonstrated capabilities far exceeding traditional military spouse roles. More importantly, she had identified the psychological patterns within my family relationships that had consistently undermined my professional development and independent decision-making authority. Her analysis had revealed that my family operated according to established hierarchical structures that required my continued subordination to maintain their own positions of relative authority and control. My father's approval of my marriage to James had been based partially on the assumption that military marriage would provide structure for my professional development, without challenging his position as the primary strategic decision-maker within family relationships. My mother's support for traditional spouse roles had reflected her investment in validating her own life choices through my apparent satisfaction with similar arrangements. Patricia's criticism of my divorce had been motivated by concern that my independence would challenge the conventional assumptions about military families that validated her own relationship with Robert and her position within the broader family structure. Sarah had observed that Patricia's commentary about military wives abandoning ship reflected personal anxiety about the implications of my transformation for her own sense of security and social status. This analysis had provided valuable framework for understanding the resistance I was encountering from family members and the strategic importance of maintaining confidentiality about my business activities until their completion. Sarah had recommended that I continue developing professional relationships that could provide genuine support for my independent objectives, while carefully managing family expectations during the transition period. My second assessment conversation had been with Colonel Amanda Richardson, a fellow military spouse who had successfully transitioned to civilian business ownership after her husband's retirement 3 years earlier. Amanda had established a consulting firm that specialized in helping defense contractors navigate federal procurement processes, and her professional success had made her a respected figure within our military community, despite her departure from traditional spouse roles. Amanda's perspective had been particularly valuable because she had experienced similar family resistance during her own transition to independent business ownership. Her husband's military career had concluded successfully, but her decision to maintain and expand her consulting practice rather than returning to traditional spouse roles had created tensions with extended family members who had expected her to focus on supporting her husband's civilian career transition. Her advice had been both practical and strategic. She had emphasized the importance of demonstrating professional competence through concrete achievements, rather than attempting to persuade family members through argument or explanation. Her experience had shown that successful business outcomes provided undeniable evidence of capability that could overcome initial skepticism and resistance from those who had previously dismissed independent professional activities. Amanda had also provided specific guidance about managing the psychological challenges of family relationship transitions. Her observation that family members often perceived independent success as implicit criticism of their own choices had helped me understand the defensive reactions I had been encountering. She had recommended maintaining respectful but firm boundaries around professional activities, while avoiding detailed explanations that might be interpreted as justification or permission-seeking behavior. Most importantly, Amanda had introduced me to a network of women who had successfully navigated similar transitions from traditional military spouse roles to independent business ownership. This network included defense contractors, real estate developers, financial advisors, and other professionals who had built substantial businesses while managing complex family and community relationships. The third crucial conversation had been with my younger brother Michael, who had recently completed his military service as a logistics officer and was beginning a civilian career in supply chain management. Michael had always been the family member most likely to provide objective perspective rather than reflexive support for established patterns, and his recent transition from military to civilian employment had given him fresh insight into the challenges of professional development outside traditional military structures. Michael's response to my situation had been markedly different from other family reactions. Rather than expressing concern about my divorce or questioning my judgment, he had been genuinely interested in my strategic planning activities and impressed by the scope of my land acquisition project. His military logistics background had provided him with understanding of the complexity involved in federal property disposition procedures and the expertise required for successful navigation of government contracting processes. His assessment had revealed that my professional accomplishments significantly exceeded what other family members understood or appreciated. From his perspective, my successful management of the land acquisition project demonstrated strategic planning capabilities that would be valued in senior executive roles within major corporations or government agencies. He had observed that my family's continued focus on traditional spouse roles reflected their failure to recognize the evolution of my professional capabilities during 12 years of strategic development. Michael had also provided valuable intelligence about family dynamics and relationship patterns that I had not previously recognized. His position as the youngest family member had given him observer perspective on established hierarchies and communication patterns that older family members took for granted. His analysis had revealed that my parents' resistance to my independence was motivated partially by concern that my success would highlight their own limited understanding of contemporary professional opportunities and business development strategies. The fourth significant conversation had been with my longtime friend Captain Jennifer Walsh, who served as a military attorney specializing in personnel law and administrative procedures. Jennifer and I had maintained a professional relationship since our initial meeting during my first year at Fort Braxton, when she had provided legal guidance about spouse employment opportunities and professional development options within military communities. Jennifer's perspective had been particularly valuable because she possessed detailed understanding of military administrative procedures and the potential career implications of my divorce for James's continued service. Her analysis had confirmed that my land acquisition activities had been structured appropriately to avoid conflicts of interest or regulatory violations that might affect James's position as base commander. More importantly, Jennifer had provided strategic advice about managing the disclosure of my business activities when the land acquisition project reached completion. Her experience with military personnel law had given her insight into the procedures and protocols that would govern James's continued service once his ex-wife became the private owner of the property where he commanded military operations. Jennifer had also validated my strategic approach to family relationship management during the transition period. Her observation that premature disclosure of significant business activities often created unnecessary complications had reinforced my decision to maintain confidentiality until project completion. She had recommended that I continue focusing on professional execution rather than family education, until concrete results provided indisputable evidence of my capabilities. The fifth crucial assessment had been with Dr. Marcus Webb, an organizational consultant who specialized in leadership development within military and defense industry contexts. Marcus had been recommended by Amanda Richardson as someone who could provide objective analysis of my strategic planning process and professional development trajectory. Marcus's evaluation had focused on identifying the transferable skills and capabilities that I had developed through military spouse experiences, and how these could be leveraged for continued business success beyond the immediate land acquisition project. His assessment had revealed that my experience managing complex stakeholder relationships, coordinating logistics across multiple locations, and maintaining operational effectiveness during extended periods of separation had provided excellent preparation for senior executive responsibilities. His analysis had also addressed the psychological aspects of transitioning from traditional spouse roles to independent business ownership. Marcus had observed that my systematic approach to capability development and strategic planning demonstrated the type of disciplined thinking that characterized successful executives in high-stakes business environments. His assessment had suggested that my land acquisition project represented an appropriate first step toward larger strategic objectives rather than a terminal achievement. The conversation with Marcus had provided external validation of my professional development trajectory while also identifying opportunities for continued growth that extended beyond real estate development. His recommendation that I consider pursuing additional business partnerships and investment opportunities had reinforced my confidence in the strategic foundation I had been building for future professional activities. The sixth assessment conversation had been with my financial advisor, Rebecca Santos, who had been managing my personal investments and retirement planning for the past 5 years. Rebecca had provided financial planning services to numerous military families and had extensive experience with the unique challenges and opportunities associated with military career transitions. Rebecca's analysis of my financial position had confirmed that the land acquisition project represented sound strategic investment rather than speculative risk-taking. Her evaluation of the regional economic trends and development potential had validated the assumptions underlying my business planning process. More importantly, her assessment had demonstrated that my personal financial management during 12 years of military marriage had created the foundation for continued business development activities beyond the immediate project. Rebecca had also provided perspective on the family dynamics surrounding my divorce and business activities. Her experience working with military families had given her insight into the psychological patterns that often emerged when traditional spouse roles evolved toward independent professional activities. Her observation that family resistance frequently intensified before eventual acceptance had prepared me for managing continued challenges during the transition period. The seventh significant conversation had been with Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, Margaret's husband, and a career military officer who specialized in base operations and administrative management. David had provided insight into the operational implications of base closure procedures and the potential impacts on military personnel who would be affected by property transition to civilian ownership. David's perspective had been particularly valuable because he understood both military operational requirements and civilian business considerations. His analysis had confirmed that my strategic approach to the land acquisition project had appropriately considered the interests of military personnel while protecting my own business objectives. He had also provided advice about managing the inevitable complications that would arise when James learned about my ownership of Fort Braxton property. David's assessment had revealed that my strategic planning process had demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military operations and administrative procedures that many civilian business owners would lack. His observation that my success in navigating federal property acquisition procedures reflected capabilities that would be valuable for continued defense industry involvement had provided additional validation of my professional development trajectory. The pattern that emerged from these assessment conversations was clear and consistent. Professionals who evaluated my activities according to objective criteria recognized significant capability and strategic planning expertise that my family relationships had consistently failed to acknowledge or value. The disconnect between professional validation and family resistance reflected fundamental differences in evaluation criteria and relationship expectations, rather than actual deficiencies in my performance or judgment. The network of supportive professionals that I had developed through strategic relationship building provided both practical resources and psychological support for managing the challenges associated with major life transitions. These relationships were based on demonstrated competence and mutual professional benefit, rather than inherited social positions or traditional role expectations. In contrast, my family relationships were structured around established hierarchies and conventional expectations that required my continued subordination to maintain their stability. The resistance I was encountering reflected their investment in maintaining traditional patterns, rather than objective assessment of my capabilities or strategic planning effectiveness. This recognition had provided crucial insight into the relationship management strategy that would be necessary during the upcoming revelation period. Family members who benefited from my traditional spouse role would require time and concrete evidence to adjust their expectations and relationship assumptions. Professional contacts who already recognized my capabilities would provide essential support during this transition period. The assessment process had also revealed opportunities for continued development of supportive professional relationships that could facilitate future business activities. The network of successful women who had navigated similar transitions provided both practical guidance and ongoing mentorship opportunities that would be valuable for long-term professional growth. Most importantly, the comprehensive support system assessment had demonstrated that my strategic planning process had been appropriate and that my professional development trajectory was sustainable beyond the immediate land acquisition project. The foundation for continued independent success had been established through careful relationship building and demonstrated competence rather than temporary circumstances or family connections. The approaching revelation of my land ownership would test every relationship within my personal and professional networks. The assessment conversations had provided clear understanding of which relationships would adapt successfully to changed circumstances and which would require fundamental restructuring or potential termination. This knowledge would be essential for managing the complex transition period that would follow the completion of my strategic objectives. The psychological complexity of orchestrating such a fundamental transformation while maintaining existing relationship facades created internal tensions that demanded careful management during the 3 weeks following my comprehensive support system assessment. Despite the clear evidence from professional contacts that my strategic planning represented sophisticated business development, I found myself wrestling with deeply ingrained patterns of seeking family approval and minimizing potential conflict that had been reinforced through decades of military community socialization. The rational part of my mind understood that my land acquisition project demonstrated capabilities and achievements that exceeded anything my family had accomplished in civilian business contexts. The financial projections, partnership agreements, and regulatory compliance documentation that filled my study represented months of intensive professional work that would be respected in any major corporate environment. Yet the emotional patterns established through years of family dynamics continued to generate anxiety about the inevitable confrontations that would accompany the revelation of my independent success. This internal conflict manifested most clearly during my interactions with James throughout the divorce proceedings. Despite our growing emotional distance and fundamental disagreements about future priorities, I continued to provide strategic support for his base command responsibilities when he requested assistance with stakeholder management or community relations challenges. My professional background in defense contracting and government relations remained valuable for addressing the complex political and administrative issues that affected Fort Braxton operations. The irony of this situation had become increasingly apparent as my land acquisition project approached completion. James continued to benefit from my strategic expertise, while remaining completely unaware that his ex-wife was positioning herself to become the private owner of the property where he served. His assumptions about my post-divorce financial situation and professional prospects were based on traditional military spouse patterns, rather than recognition of the sophisticated business activities I had been developing during our marriage. My continued assistance with his professional challenges reflected psychological patterns that I recognized as counterproductive but struggled to modify immediately. The habit of subordinating my own interests to support James's career objectives had been reinforced through 12 years of marriage and represented emotional investment that could not be abandoned through rational decision-making alone. The professional validation I received from helping him address complex administrative and political challenges provided temporary satisfaction that competed with my longer-term strategic objectives. These conflicted motivations became particularly evident during a conversation we had regarding potential base closure implications for military personnel and their families. James had requested my perspective on community relations strategies that might help maintain political support for continued base operations. unaware that my actual objective involved facilitating the transition to civilian ownership rather than preventing base closure. I had provided thoughtful analysis of regional political dynamics and stakeholder interests while carefully avoiding any disclosure of my personal involvement in private development activities. The conversation had required sophisticated management of competing loyalties and information constraints that highlighted the psychological complexity of my situation. My genuine concern for military families who would be affected by base closure competed with my strategic interest in successful completion of the land acquisition project. This internal tension had extended to my interactions with military community organizations and social groups, where I maintained established relationships and ongoing responsibilities. My position as spouse of the base commander had created expectations for continued participation in charity events, family support activities, and community relations programs that would be affected by our divorce and my eventual revelation as the new property owner. The Military Family Life Counseling Program had requested my continued involvement in developing resources for spouses managing deployment separations and family transitions. My experience and professional background made me a valuable contributor to these programs, and my participation had been viewed as evidence of my continued commitment to military community support despite my personal marital difficulties. Yet my increasing focus on business development activities and strategic planning for post-divorce professional activities had created time constraints that made maintaining these community commitments increasingly challenging. The recognition that my future role within the military community would be fundamentally different once my land ownership became public had made continued investment in traditional spouse activities feel incongruous with my actual trajectory. Similar tensions emerged in my relationships with other military spouses who had provided friendship and support throughout my marriage to James. These relationships had been based on shared experiences of deployment separations, relocation challenges, and the unique stresses associated with military family life. My divorce proceedings had already altered these relationship dynamics, as some spouses had interpreted my decision to end my marriage as implicit criticism of their own choices to maintain traditional military marriages despite similar challenges. The prospect of revealing my business success and land ownership created additional complications for these relationships. My financial independence and professional achievements would demonstrate alternatives to traditional military spouse roles that might be unwelcome reminders of opportunities that other spouses had not pursued or had been unable to develop. The potential for my transformation to create discomfort or resentment among friends who had provided important emotional support during difficult periods represented a significant psychological burden. My relationship with my parents during this period reflected the most complex aspects of my internal resistance to fully embracing the implications of my strategic planning success. Their expressions of concern about my divorce and suggestions for reconciliation with James were delivered with genuine care and reflected their sincere belief that my decision represented emotional instability rather than strategic repositioning. My father's periodic inquiries about my financial planning and post-divorce living arrangements were motivated by parental responsibility rather than dismissive condescension. His offers to provide assistance with housing deposits or career transition expenses reflected his assumption that I would require family support during the adjustment period following my divorce. These offers created emotional responses that competed with my rational knowledge of my actual financial situation and business prospects. The temptation to relieve his concerns by providing information about my land acquisition project and financial independence represented a significant challenge to my strategic commitment to maintaining confidentiality until project completion. The desire to demonstrate that his daughter had developed capabilities and achieved success that exceeded his expectations competed with the professional necessity of protecting sensitive business information during critical negotiation periods. My mother's expressions of disappointment about my marriage ending created similar internal conflicts. Her perspective on military marriages reflected her own successful navigation of the challenges associated with supporting my father's career while maintaining family stability and community relationships. Her suggestion that I might benefit from marriage counseling or temporary separation rather than permanent divorce reflected her genuine belief in the value of traditional military family structures. These maternal concerns created emotional resonance that challenged my confidence in my independent decision-making. The possibility that my strategic planning represented avoidance of necessary relationship work rather than mature recognition of fundamental incompatibilities, required ongoing psychological examination. The financial independence and professional success that my business activities would provide did not automatically resolve questions about whether my marriage could have been preserved through different approaches or greater commitment to traditional spouse roles. Patricia's continued commentary about military family values and appropriate spouse behavior during family gatherings represented the most direct challenge to my emerging independent identity. Her criticism of my divorce as evidence of selfishness and disloyalty created defensive reactions that consumed emotional energy and distracted from productive focus on strategic objectives. The psychological impact of her disapproval was magnified by her position as James's sister and her role as spokesperson for extended family concerns about my character and judgment. Her ability to influence other family members' perceptions of my situation created social pressure that activated deeply ingrained patterns of seeking approval and avoiding conflict. My rational understanding that Patricia's criticism reflected her own insecurities and investment in traditional relationship structures provided limited protection against the emotional impact of her dismissive commentary. The anticipation of her reaction to my eventual business success created anxiety that competed with professional excitement about project completion and strategic achievement. The management of these competing psychological pressures required deliberate strategies for maintaining focus on strategic objectives while processing emotional responses to family disapproval and social pressure. My conversations with Dr. Sarah Mitchell provided professional support for developing coping mechanisms and maintaining perspective during this challenging transition period. Sarah's analysis had emphasized that my internal resistance to fully embracing my transformation reflected normal psychological adjustment to major life changes, rather than evidence of poor decision-making or inadequate strategic planning. Her observation that successful transitions typically involve periods of emotional ambivalence and conflicted loyalties had provided reassurance that my psychological struggles were predictable rather than problematic. Her recommendation that I maintain regular self-assessment regarding my motivations and objectives had proven valuable for distinguishing between productive concerns about strategic implementation and counterproductive emotional reactions to family disapproval. The practice of examining my decisions according to objective criteria for professional success, rather than subjective measures of family approval, had helped maintain focus on strategic priorities during emotionally challenging periods. The financial projections and partnership agreements that documented my business development progress provided concrete evidence of achievement that could be referenced when family criticism activated self-doubt or uncertainty about my strategic direction. The external validation from professional contacts and business partners offered alternative perspective that balanced family resistance with objective assessment of my capabilities and accomplishments. My continuing education in real estate development and property management had provided additional structure for maintaining forward momentum despite psychological resistance to complete transformation. The technical knowledge and professional certifications that I was pursuing would enhance my credibility as a property owner and create foundation for expanded business activities beyond the immediate land acquisition project. The recognition that my internal resistance reflected attachment to familiar relationship patterns rather than accurate assessment of strategic opportunities had been crucial for maintaining commitment to my planned trajectory. The comfort of traditional spouse roles and established family dynamics represented psychological security that was being sacrificed in exchange for financial independence and professional fulfillment that remained partially theoretical until project completion. This understanding had enabled me to acknowledge my emotional attachment to familiar patterns while maintaining intellectual commitment to strategic objectives that would create long-term benefits despite short-term relationship complications. The temporary nature of the psychological adjustment period provided perspective that helped sustain motivation during particularly challenging moments of family conflict or internal doubt. The approaching completion of my land acquisition project represented not only business achievement but also psychological transformation that would require continued adjustment and strategic relationship management. The internal resistance I was experiencing during the preparation phase would likely intensify during the revelation period when family members learned about my actual accomplishments and financial situation. The recognition that psychological resistance was a normal component of major life transitions rather than evidence of strategic error had provided foundation for developing mental preparation strategies for the upcoming confrontations and relationship restructuring that would accompany my public success. The emotional investment in family approval that had created internal conflict would need to be redirected toward professional relationships and strategic objectives that aligned with my actual capabilities and achievements. The denial phase that I was experiencing regarding the full implications of my transformation would conclude naturally as external circumstances forced recognition of changed relationship dynamics and strategic positions. The completion of legal documentation and financial arrangements would create objective reality that would override psychological resistance and emotional attachment to traditional relationship patterns. The strategic foundation that I had built through careful planning and professional development would provide stability during the emotional turbulence that would accompany family relationship adjustments and community position changes. The business success and financial independence that my project would demonstrate would create new opportunities for professional development and strategic contribution that would ultimately justify the psychological costs of transformation. My resistance to fully embracing the implications of my strategic success reflected normal human attachment to familiar circumstances, rather than deficiencies in my planning or execution. The approaching revelation period would provide resolution to this internal conflict through external validation and concrete demonstration of achievement that would support continued confidence in my independent trajectory. The transformational encounter that would provide me with the final strategic framework for managing my upcoming revelation occurred during what appeared to be a routine business meeting with Catherine Blackwood, the former Secretary of Defense for Infrastructure and Environment, who had transitioned to private consulting after completing her government service 2 years earlier. Catherine had been recommended by Margaret Chen as someone who possessed unique expertise in military property transitions and the complex stakeholder management challenges that accompanied large-scale defense infrastructure projects. Our initial meeting had been scheduled to discuss technical aspects of federal property acquisition procedures and regulatory compliance requirements for my land development project. Catherine's government experience had included oversight of multiple base closure operations and civilian property transitions, making her perspective invaluable for ensuring successful completion of my Fort Braxton acquisition. However, our conversation evolved into something far more significant than technical consultation, when Catherine recognized the broader strategic implications of my situation and the psychological challenges I was navigating. Catherine's office in downtown Washington reflected her transition from government service to private sector leadership while maintaining connection to defense policy and military community interests. Her client portfolio included major defense contractors, regional development authorities, and private investment firms that specialized in government property acquisitions. Her reputation for managing complex stakeholder relationships and facilitating successful outcomes in politically sensitive situations had made her services highly sought after within defense industry circles. During our initial discussion of regulatory procedures and compliance requirements, Catherine had demonstrated comprehensive understanding of the technical aspects of my project, while also recognizing the strategic sophistication that my planning process represented. Her analysis had confirmed that my approach to federal property acquisition demonstrated professional expertise that would be valued in senior executive positions within major corporations or government agencies. More importantly, Catherine had identified the psychological and relationship management challenges that would accompany the successful completion of my project. Her experience with previous military property transitions had provided her with understanding of the complex dynamics that emerged when traditional military community structures were disrupted by civilian ownership and economic development activities. Catherine's perspective on my situation had been shaped by her own professional journey from military family background to senior government leadership positions. Her father had served as a career military officer, and her early experiences within military communities had provided her with intimate understanding of the social structures and relationship expectations that I was preparing to challenge through my independent business success. Her transition from traditional military family roles to government leadership had required her to navigate similar psychological tensions between family expectations and professional achievements. Her insights into managing these competing loyalties while maintaining strategic focus on long-term objectives had proven directly applicable to my current situation, The catalyst moment in our conversation had occurred when Catherine directly addressed my psychological resistance to fully embracing the implications of my strategic success. She had observed that my continued provision of strategic support to James and my emotional investment in family approval reflected patterns that could undermine my ability to capitalize on the opportunities that my business achievement would create. Catherine's analysis had revealed that my attachment to traditional relationship roles represented more than emotional comfort or psychological security. The patterns of subordinating my professional accomplishments to support others' objectives had become deeply integrated into my identity and decision-making processes in ways that could limit my effectiveness as an independent business leader and property owner. Her framework for understanding this challenge had drawn from organizational psychology research regarding executive leadership development and the transition from supporting roles to primary decision-making authority. Catherine had explained that individuals who demonstrated exceptional capability in strategic support positions often experienced difficulty transitioning to roles that required them to prioritize their own objectives over the needs of previous beneficiaries of their support. This analysis had provided crucial insight into the internal conflicts I was experiencing regarding family relationships and community responsibilities. My psychological resistance to fully embracing my transformation was not evidence of inadequate strategic planning or poor judgment, but rather a predictable challenge that accompanied successful transitions from supporting roles to leadership positions. Catherine's recommendations for managing this transition had been both strategic and practical. She had emphasized the importance of recognizing that my land acquisition success would create obligations and opportunities that would require my complete professional attention and strategic focus. The scope of responsibility associated with major property ownership and development would demand decision-making capabilities and leadership skills that would be incompatible with continued subordination of my interests to support others' objectives. Her experience with executive leadership development had demonstrated that successful transitions to primary decision-making authority required conscious restructuring of relationship patterns and strategic priorities. The psychological comfort associated with traditional supporting roles had to be replaced with confidence in independent judgment and willingness to accept the isolation that often accompanied leadership positions. Catherine had also provided specific guidance regarding the stakeholder management challenges that would emerge once my land ownership became public knowledge. Her experience with politically sensitive property transitions had shown that successful outcomes required proactive communication strategies and careful management of competing interests among various stakeholder groups. The revelation of my ownership of Fort Braxton would create immediate reactions from military leadership, local political authorities, business communities, and media organizations that would require sophisticated response strategies. Catherine had recommended developing comprehensive communication plans that would position my acquisition as beneficial for regional economic development, while addressing concerns about military operational continuity and community stability. Her analysis had identified specific stakeholder groups that would require targeted communication approaches based on their particular interests and concerns. Military leadership would need reassurance about operational continuity and property management policies that would support continued effective base operations. Local political authorities would require information about economic development plans and community benefit programs that would demonstrate positive regional impact. Business communities would be interested in development opportunities and partnership possibilities that my property ownership would create. Media organizations would require accurate information and access to credible sources that would support balanced reporting about the property transition and its implications for military and civilian communities. Catherine's expertise in managing complex stakeholder relationships had enabled her to provide detailed guidance regarding timing, messaging, and communication channels that would optimize outcomes while minimizing potential complications or negative reactions. Her strategic framework had addressed both immediate disclosure management and long-term relationship development that would support successful property management and business expansion. The conversation had also addressed the psychological preparation required for managing the inevitable family confrontations that would accompany the revelation of my business success. Catherine's own experience with family relationship challenges during her career advancement had provided her with practical strategies for maintaining professional focus while processing emotional reactions from family members who felt threatened or confused by independent achievement. Her analysis had emphasized that family resistance to my transformation would likely intensify before eventual acceptance, as the full implications of my strategic success became apparent. The financial independence and professional recognition that my land ownership would demonstrate would force family members to reconsider fundamental assumptions about my capabilities and potential that had shaped their treatment of me throughout my adult life. Catherine had recommended that I prepare for family confrontations by developing clear understanding of my strategic objectives and the business rationale for my decisions, rather than attempting to address emotional concerns or seeking approval for my professional activities. Her experience had shown that family members typically required time and concrete evidence of success before adjusting their expectations and relationship approaches. The most significant aspect of Catherine's guidance had been her analysis of the leadership development opportunities that my situation would create. Her assessment had revealed that my successful completion of the land acquisition project had demonstrated capabilities that would be valued for senior executive positions within major corporations, government agencies, or defense industry organizations. The strategic planning, stakeholder management, and financial coordination skills that I had developed through the property acquisition process represented transferable capabilities that could be applied to increasingly complex business challenges and leadership responsibilities. Catherine had identified specific professional development opportunities that would enable me to capitalize on my demonstrated expertise while continuing to expand my capabilities and strategic influence. Her recommendations had included pursuing board positions with regional economic development organizations, joining professional associations for defense industry executives, and developing relationships with investment firms that specialized in government property development projects. These activities would provide platforms for demonstrating my strategic expertise while creating networks that could support continued business expansion and professional advancement. Catherine had also addressed the importance of developing comprehensive financial management strategies that would optimize the long-term value of my property investment, while creating foundation for additional business ventures. Her experience with large-scale property development had provided her with understanding of the capital allocation decisions and partnership opportunities that would maximize returns while maintaining strategic flexibility for future projects. The technical aspects of her guidance had included specific recommendations regarding property management policies, tenant selection criteria, and development partnerships that would balance military operational requirements with civilian economic development objectives. Her analysis had demonstrated that successful property management would require sophisticated understanding of both military needs and civilian business requirements. The strategic framework that Catherine had provided had also addressed the broader implications of my transformation for military-community relationships and defense industry involvement. Her assessment had suggested that my unique position as both former military spouse and major property owner would create opportunities for contributing to policy discussions and strategic planning processes that affected military families and defense infrastructure development. These opportunities would require me to develop expertise in areas such as military family support programs, defense infrastructure policy, and public-private partnership development that would extend my professional capabilities beyond real estate development and property management. Catherine had identified specific educational and networking activities that would prepare me for meaningful contribution to these broader policy and strategic discussions. The conversation with Catherine had concluded with her offer to provide ongoing strategic consultation and professional mentorship, as my situation evolved from property acquisition completion through the complex stakeholder management challenges that would accompany public disclosure and operational transition. Her willingness to maintain supportive professional relationship had provided crucial foundation for managing the uncertainty and challenges that would characterize the upcoming revelation period. The framework that Catherine had provided had fundamentally altered my understanding of the psychological challenges I was experiencing and the strategic opportunities that my transformation would create. Her analysis had demonstrated that my internal resistance to fully embracing my success reflected normal leadership development challenges rather than evidence of inadequate strategic planning or personal weakness. More importantly, her guidance had provided specific strategies for managing family relationships, stakeholder communications, and professional development activities that would enable me to capitalize on my achievements while maintaining appropriate boundaries and strategic focus. The recognition that my situation represented a leadership development opportunity rather than simply a personal life transition had shifted my perspective from defensive management of family criticism to proactive preparation for expanded professional responsibilities. The comprehensive strategic framework that Catherine had provided would serve as foundation for navigating the complex challenges and opportunities that would emerge during the upcoming disclosure period. Her expertise and continued availability for consultation had created crucial support structure that would enable me to maintain confidence and strategic focus during what would undoubtedly be a turbulent transition period. The catalyst that Catherine represented had provided me with the final tools and perspective necessary for fully embracing my transformation and preparing for the leadership responsibilities that my success would create. The psychological resistance and internal conflicts that had characterized my recent thinking had been replaced with clear understanding of strategic objectives and professional development opportunities that would justify the relationship complications and emotional challenges that lay ahead. The implementation of Catherine's strategic framework commenced with systematic restructuring of professional and personal communication approaches across all relationship contexts that had previously operated according to established patterns of accommodation and strategic subordination. The comprehensive guidance received regarding leadership transition principles and stakeholder management protocols required careful application to existing relationships while maintaining confidentiality regarding business activities that remained in development phases. The strategic objective involved demonstrating fundamental shifts in priorities and decision-making authority without premature disclosure of sensitive information that might compromise ongoing negotiations or create unnecessary complications during critical project completion periods. The initial implementation opportunity emerged during scheduled mediation sessions with James regarding divorce settlement terms and property division arrangements. These meetings provided controlled professional environment for testing new communication approaches while addressing practical matters that required resolution for legal proceedings completion. Margaret Chen's legal expertise ensured appropriate protection of interests, while the mediation format enabled systematic demonstration of altered relationship dynamics, without creating confrontational situations that might escalate unnecessarily or compromise strategic positioning. James had approached these settlement discussions with apparent confidence that established patterns of collaborative decision-making and mutual accommodation would continue despite our marriage dissolution. His preparation suggested assumption that I would maintain supportive approach to his career protection priorities, while accepting reasonable financial arrangements that reflected traditional post-divorce dependency relationships. The tone and content of his initial proposals indicated expectation that our established communication patterns would facilitate efficient resolution of practical matters without substantial negotiation or strategic complexity. The implementation of Catherine's boundary establishment protocols required fundamental alteration of my response patterns, while maintaining professional courtesy and legal cooperation necessary for efficient proceedings completion. Rather than providing strategic advice regarding career implications or offering accommodation of his scheduling preferences and procedural concerns, I maintained exclusive focus on settlement terms and legal requirements that served my independent strategic objectives. This altered approach created immediate recognition that our interaction dynamics had shifted substantially. James's attempts to engage me in discussions regarding military community perceptions or potential impact of divorce proceedings on his promotion prospects met with professional acknowledgement but strategic unavailability that forced him to seek guidance from alternative sources. The absence of my customary strategic consultation and problem-solving support required him to develop independent approaches to challenges that had previously been addressed through collaborative planning and shared expertise. The mediation sessions provided additional opportunities for demonstrating professional competence and strategic thinking that challenged his assumptions about my capabilities and post-divorce prospects. My presentation of financial projections and settlement counterproposals reflected sophisticated understanding of property law and investment planning that exceeded his expectations based on traditional military spouse role observations. The specificity and strategic logic of my proposals required him to engage with me as equal negotiating partner rather than dependent party requiring protective financial arrangements. Margaret's subsequent analysis confirmed that these sessions had successfully established different relationship foundations, while maintaining appropriate legal cooperation and avoiding unnecessary conflict escalation. Her observation that James had recognized fundamental changes in my strategic approach, despite remaining unaware of specific factors producing this transformation, validated the effectiveness of Catherine's communication strategies for boundary establishment without premature information disclosure. The second significant implementation context involved family relationship management during regularly scheduled gatherings and communication interactions. The strategic challenge required demonstrating altered priorities and decision-making independence while maintaining respectful family connections and avoiding confrontational dynamics that might prompt intrusive questioning about personal circumstances or strategic planning activities. My parents had established routine patterns of family involvement that included regular consultation regarding major decisions and acceptance of guidance on practical matters affecting personal and professional development. These interaction patterns reflected their genuine care and concern while also serving to maintain established hierarchical relationships and decision-making authority structures that positioned them as primary advisors and final approval sources for important life choices. The implementation of professional boundary establishment required systematic modification of these interaction patterns without direct confrontation or detailed explanation that might compromise confidentiality requirements. The approach involved acknowledging parental concern and expressing appreciation for guidance, while clearly communicating that decision-making authority resided with me, rather than family committee structures or consensus-building processes. Family dinner conversations provided specific opportunities for demonstrating these altered approaches. When discussions addressed divorce proceedings or post-marriage planning, I maintained professional focus on practical arrangements, while declining to engage in emotional processing or detailed explanation of strategic reasoning that might reveal business activities or financial positioning. This approach prevented information gathering that might be used for continued pressure campaigns, while demonstrating confident independence and strategic clarity. My father's attempts to provide guidance regarding financial planning and career development met with respectful acknowledgement but firm boundaries regarding decision-making authority and strategic planning responsibility. His military background provided him with understanding of complex planning requirements, yet his assumptions about my capabilities and resources were based on traditional spouse role observations rather than recognition of professional development that had occurred during marriage years. The challenge involved maintaining respectful father-daughter relationships while clearly establishing that his guidance, while valued, would not serve as determining factor in strategic decisions affecting my professional development and financial management. The implementation required consistent demonstration of independent judgment and strategic competence, without creating unnecessary family conflict or emotional confrontation. My mother's expressions of concern regarding divorce implications and practical challenges required similar boundary management approaches. Her perspective on marriage and family relationships reflected genuine beliefs about commitment and stability that had shaped her own life choices and strategic priorities. Her suggestions regarding counseling or mediation to address marriage difficulties represented sincere desire to support relationship preservation rather than manipulation or control attempts. The response strategy involved acknowledging her values and expressing appreciation for concern while maintaining clear communication that decision-making regarding marriage and career development remained my independent responsibility. This approach required balance between emotional acknowledgement and professional boundary maintenance that preserved family relationships while establishing appropriate decision-making authority. Patricia's continued commentary about military family values and appropriate spouse behavior required more direct boundary establishment due to her increasingly aggressive criticism and apparent coordination with other family members to apply pressure for compliance with traditional role expectations. Her approach had evolved beyond casual concern toward direct challenges regarding judgment and character that demanded professional response rather than accommodation or defensive justification. The implementation of Catherine's communication protocols involved acknowledging her perspective while clearly communicating that family committee approval was not required for personal decision-making regarding marriage, career development, or financial planning. This approach prevented engagement in defensive arguments while establishing appropriate boundaries regarding family influence and decision-making authority. The third implementation area addressed professional relationships within military community contexts and charitable organization responsibilities that had provided social connections and community contribution opportunities throughout marriage years. These relationships represented genuine value both personally and professionally, yet continued intensive involvement created time constraints that interfered with business development priorities and strategic planning requirements during critical project completion periods. The Military Family Life Counseling Program had benefited substantially from my strategic communication expertise and organizational development contributions. My professional background provided valuable capabilities for program enhancement and resource development that served important community needs. Yet the approaching completion of land acquisition project required increased focus on business responsibilities that would make continued intensive program involvement increasingly difficult to maintain. The implementation strategy involved gradual transition of responsibilities to other qualified volunteers while maintaining supportive relationships with program leadership and participants. This approach enabled continued community contribution while protecting time and energy necessary for business success. The transition required careful management to avoid creating questions about changing circumstances or reduced availability that might compromise confidentiality regarding business activities. Similar adjustments were necessary regarding charitable event coordination and social activities associated with base command responsibilities. The expectations for continued participation reflected assumption that divorce would not affect community connections or availability for supporting military family programs. Yet strategic priorities required reducing these commitments to focus on property management and business development activities that would determine transformation success. The approach involved selective participation in activities that utilize strategic communication expertise, while declining expanded involvement or leadership roles that would require significant time commitments during critical business development periods. This balance maintained positive community relationships while preserving resources necessary for professional success and strategic objective achievement. The fourth implementation context addressed business relationship management with development partners and professional advisors who possessed knowledge of land acquisition activities but remained uninformed about family relationship dynamics and community pressure situations. These relationships required appropriate preparation for increased attention and potential complications that would accompany public disclosure of property ownership without providing detailed information about personal circumstances that were not relevant to business assessment criteria. Development partners and financial advisors needed sufficient information to prepare for media attention and community reactions that typically accompany military property transitions to civilian ownership. Yet excessive detail about family relationship challenges might compromise their assessment of professional capabilities or strategic judgment that were essential for continued business relationship maintenance and project success. The communication strategy involved emphasizing regional economic development benefits and military community support aspects of property acquisition while acknowledging that ownership transitions typically generate community interest and discussion. This approach provided appropriate preparation information while maintaining professional focus on business objectives rather than personal relationship complications. Professional partners' understanding of potential challenges enabled them to prepare appropriate responses to inquiries about project qualifications and strategic objectives without requiring knowledge of family dynamics that were not germane to business evaluation. Their confidence in project viability and strategic planning remained based on demonstrated competence and professional expertise rather than personal circumstances or family relationship stability. The cumulative effect of implementing Catherine's strategic framework across these diverse relationship contexts demonstrated that fundamental alteration of communication patterns and priority structures was creating predictable reactions among stakeholder groups who had previously benefited from my accommodation and strategic subordination. The resistance and confusion generated by boundary establishment efforts provided valuable intelligence regarding actual relationship dynamics and stakeholder motivations that had not been previously apparent. Family members' increased pressure and coordination efforts revealed the extent to which their supportive expressions had been contingent on my continued compliance with traditional role expectations, rather than genuine support for independent strategic development. Community relationships that had appeared collaborative were demonstrating dependencies on my availability for supporting others' objectives, rather than mutual professional respect and contribution recognition. Professional relationships and business partnerships were adapting successfully to altered communication approaches while maintaining focus on strategic objectives and performance criteria. These relationships provided foundation for continued professional development and business expansion that aligned with authentic capabilities rather than inherited social positions or traditional role expectations. The implementation process was establishing a central foundation for managing more significant challenges that would emerge once land ownership became public knowledge, and family members discovered the scope of strategic planning and business success that had been developing during marriage years. The boundary establishment and priority demonstration that characterized this initial change period would prove crucial for maintaining leadership authority and strategic focus during complex stakeholder management challenges that would accompany public disclosure and property ownership transition. During the 2 weeks following my initial implementation of Catherine's strategic framework, the coordinated nature of this pushback revealed the extent to which my traditional compliance had supported established power dynamics within family and community relationships. The escalation occurred across multiple fronts simultaneously, suggesting deliberate organization rather than spontaneous reactions to my altered behavior patterns. The most aggressive resistance emerged from Patricia, who had apparently recognized that my reduced responsiveness to family pressure represented a fundamental threat to her position as family spokesperson and decision-making influence coordinator. Her approach evolved from casual commentary about military family values to direct challenges regarding my judgment and character that were clearly designed to provoke emotional responses and defensive justifications that would restore her authority over family relationship dynamics. The escalation began during a telephone conversation on Wednesday evening, when Patricia called ostensibly to discuss arrangements for my father's upcoming birthday celebration. However, the conversation quickly shifted to detailed criticism of my divorce decision and specific accusations regarding my abandonment of family responsibilities and military community obligations. Her tone had shifted from disappointed concern to aggressive confrontation that revealed her recognition that traditional influence strategies were no longer producing desired compliance responses. Patricia's specific accusations focused on my alleged selfishness in prioritizing personal desires over family stability, and my apparent disregard for the impact of my divorce on James's military career and reputation within the community. She characterized my boundary establishment efforts as evidence of emotional instability, and suggested that my reduced availability for family activities reflected psychological problems that required professional intervention and family support to address effectively. The strategic sophistication of her approach was evident in her attempt to recruit other family members as allies in applying coordinated pressure for my return to traditional compliance patterns. She referenced conversations with my mother regarding concerns about my isolation and apparent rejection of family guidance. She mentioned discussions with my father about practical challenges I would face as a divorced woman without adequate financial resources or professional qualifications for independent living. Most significantly, Patricia revealed that she had initiated contact with James to express family concerns about my behavior and decision-making during the divorce proceedings. This strategic coordination between my ex-husband and his sister represented a serious escalation that could potentially complicate both my legal proceedings and my business activities, if not managed appropriately through professional legal and strategic consultation. My response to Patricia's confrontational approach required careful implementation of Catherine's guidance regarding professional communication under pressure while maintaining appropriate boundaries and avoiding reactive emotional engagement that might compromise my strategic positioning. The temptation to provide detailed justification for my decisions or to reveal information about my actual financial situation and business activities was substantial, particularly when confronted with direct accusations regarding my character and judgment. The strategic approach that Catherine had recommended involved acknowledging Patricia's concerns without accepting her characterizations, or providing detailed explanations that might reveal sensitive information or create opportunities for continued manipulation. My responses emphasized respect for her perspective while clearly communicating that my decisions were based on careful consideration and would not be subject to family committee review or approval processes. This professional communication approach obviously frustrated Patricia, who had expected either defensive justification that would provide ammunition for continued pressure campaigns, or angry reactions that would validate her characterizations of my emotional instability. The calm professionalism of my responses forced her to escalate her accusations and demands in ways that revealed her actual motivations and strategic objectives rather than genuine concern for my well-being. The second front of escalated resistance emerged through my parents' increased coordination of family pressure strategies, designed to isolate me from independent decision-making resources and force my acceptance of family guidance and oversight. This campaign began with my mother's announcement that she had scheduled an appointment with Dr. Richards, the family counselor who had provided services during my father's post-retirement adjustment period, for the purpose of addressing family relationship challenges that my divorce was creating. The announcement was presented as family concern for my emotional health and practical preparation for post-divorce challenges, but the strategic objective was clearly to establish family oversight of my transition planning and decision-making processes. The counseling format would provide structured environment for family members to present coordinated concerns about my judgment, while positioning professional therapeutic authority to support their recommendations for my acceptance of traditional dependency relationships. My mother's assumption that I would comply with this family counseling arrangement reflected her confidence that maternal authority and expressions of care would overcome my resistance to family oversight. Her disappointment when I declined to participate in counseling sessions that had been arranged without my consultation created additional family tension that required careful management to avoid providing justification for claims about my emotional instability or rejection of family support. The strategic challenge involved declining family counseling participation while maintaining respectful relationships and avoiding confrontational dynamics that might be interpreted as evidence supporting their concerns about my judgment or emotional state. Catherine's guidance regarding professional boundary establishment proved valuable for managing this situation through clear communication about my decision-making authority, while acknowledging family concerns without accepting their proposed solutions. My father's contribution to this escalated pressure campaign took the form of specific offers to provide financial assistance and housing arrangements that were clearly designed to create practical dependency relationships that would restore family influence over my strategic decisions. His proposal that I consider temporarily relocating to housing near my parents' home while establishing post-divorce living arrangements was presented as practical support, but represented strategic positioning to increase family oversight and reduce my independence. These offers were accompanied by detailed expressions of concern about my financial security and professional prospects that revealed family assumptions about my actual capabilities and resources. The underlying premise of these proposals was that my divorce decision had been emotionally motivated rather than strategically planned, and that practical reality would eventually force my recognition of the need for family guidance and support. My responses to these offers required acknowledgement of parental concern while maintaining firm boundaries regarding my decision-making independence and strategic planning authority. The implementation of Catherine's communication strategies enabled me to express appreciation for family support while clearly declining assistance that would compromise my autonomous strategic positioning. The third area of escalated resistance emerged through coordinated pressure from military community contacts who had apparently been recruited by James and Patricia to express concerns about my divorce decision and its implications for military family values and community stability. This pressure campaign was more subtle than direct family confrontation, but potentially more problematic due to its impact on my professional relationships and community reputation. The approach involved military spouses and community leaders expressing casual concern about my situation during social interactions and community events, with consistent messaging about the challenges facing divorced military spouses and the importance of family stability for military community strength. These expressions of concern were presented as friendly support but contained clear implications that my divorce represented selfish prioritization of personal desires over community values and family obligations. The strategic sophistication of this campaign was evident in its coordination across multiple community contacts and its focus on social pressure rather than direct confrontation. The objective was clearly to create community consensus that my divorce decision was inappropriate, and that community members should encourage my reconsideration of family reconciliation rather than supporting my independence. This community pressure campaign presented significant challenges for my continued participation in military community activities and charitable organization responsibilities. The social dynamics created by coordinated expressions of concern made continued involvement increasingly uncomfortable, while providing limited opportunities for addressing mischaracterizations without revealing sensitive information about my actual strategic positioning. My response to this community pressure required implementation of Catherine's stakeholder management strategies while maintaining appropriate professional relationships and avoiding confrontational dynamics that might escalate community conflict or compromise my business activities. The approach involved continued professional participation in appropriate community activities, while reducing availability for social interactions that might provide platforms for continued pressure campaigns. The fourth dimension of escalated resistance emerged through James's apparent recognition that our divorce proceedings were not following patterns he had expected based on traditional military spouse dependency relationships. His attempts to negotiate financial arrangements and property division terms had met with professional responses that reflected independent strategic objectives rather than dependent acceptance of his proposals for continued protective support. James's reaction to my professional negotiation approach included consultation with military legal services and community advisors, who had apparently reinforced his assumptions about traditional post-divorce relationship patterns and financial dependencies. His subsequent attempts to modify settlement terms reflected confidence that my independent positioning was temporary and that practical pressures would eventually restore his strategic advantage in negotiations. This escalation in legal and financial pressure required coordination with Margaret Chen to ensure appropriate protection of my interests, while maintaining confidentiality about business activities that could complicate divorce proceedings if disclosed prematurely. The strategic challenge involved managing increasingly aggressive negotiation tactics while preparing for potential complications that might arise if James discovered my actual financial position and business activities before settlement completion. Margaret's analysis of James's revised negotiation approach revealed his assumption that my professional responses reflected legal representation rather than independent strategic capability. His surprise at my sophisticated understanding of financial arrangements and property law suggested that he had never recognized the extent of my professional development during our marriage. Despite the fact that these capabilities had been utilized to support his career advancement for over a decade, the cumulative effect of these coordinated resistance efforts was recognition that my implementation of strategic boundary establishment had created systemic threat to established power dynamics that extended beyond individual relationship adjustments. The family and community structures that had benefited from my traditional compliance were responding with organized pressure designed to restore previous patterns rather than adapting to my emerging independence. This systematic resistance validated Catherine's analysis regarding the predictable intensification of pressure that accompanies successful transitions from supporting roles to independent leadership positions. The coordination between family members, community contacts, and legal adversaries demonstrated that my transformation represented a fundamental challenge to multiple stakeholder groups who had developed strategic dependencies on my continued subordination. The strategic necessity of maintaining professional boundaries and independent decision-making authority despite this escalated pressure was becoming increasingly apparent as my business project approached completion. The demands of property ownership and management would require complete strategic focus and leadership authority that would be incompatible with continued accommodation of family pressure campaigns or community dependency expectations. Catherine's ongoing consultation during this escalation period provided crucial support for maintaining strategic perspective and professional confidence despite the intensity of coordinated resistance. Her analysis helped distinguish between legitimate concerns that required appropriate response and manipulation tactics that demanded firm boundary maintenance without defensive justification or detailed explanation. The escalation period also provided valuable intelligence regarding the actual motivations and strategic objectives of various stakeholder groups within my family and community networks. The intensity and coordination of resistance efforts revealed the extent to which my traditional compliance had supported others' strategic positions and social status, rather than reflecting genuine partnership or mutual benefit relationships. This understanding proved essential for preparing appropriate responses to the even more significant challenges that would emerge once my land ownership became public knowledge. The stakeholder groups that were currently attempting to restore my traditional compliance would face fundamental disruption of their assumptions about my capabilities and strategic position when the scope of my business success became apparent. The escalation phase was also demonstrating the practical value of Catherine's strategic framework for managing complex stakeholder relationships under pressure. The professional communication strategies and boundary establishment protocols that she had recommended were proving effective for maintaining strategic positioning while avoiding unnecessary confrontation or premature disclosure of sensitive business information. The recognition that escalated resistance often preceded eventual acceptance provided psychological framework for managing the stress and uncertainty associated with this challenging transition period. Catherine's analysis suggested that the intensity of current pressure campaigns reflected the stakeholders' recognition that traditional influence strategies were no longer effective, forcing them to escalate tactics in final attempts to restore previous power dynamics. The approaching completion of my land acquisition project would provide definitive resolution to these escalated pressure campaigns by establishing objective evidence of my strategic capabilities and financial independence that would render continued resistance futile. The property ownership that I would soon announce would fundamentally alter every relationship dynamic by demonstrating that my divorce decision had been based on strategic positioning rather than emotional instability or practical dependency. The foundation that I was establishing through professional boundary maintenance during this escalation period would prove essential for managing the even more complex stakeholder relationships that would emerge once my transformation from military spouse to major property owner became public knowledge. The resistance that I was currently managing represented preparation for the leadership responsibilities and strategic decision-making authority that my business success would require. The intensive self-examination period that followed the coordinated resistance campaign required deliberate withdrawal from external pressures to engage in comprehensive analysis of the psychological patterns and foundational beliefs that had shaped my adult development and strategic decision-making processes. The escalated family and community pressure had created sufficient external clarity regarding relationship dynamics, but the sustainable success of my transformation required deeper understanding of the internal frameworks that had previously supported my compliance with subordinate roles, despite possessing capabilities that warranted independent leadership positions. This introspective process began during a week-long retreat at a professional development center in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, where I could engage in structured self-assessment without interruption from family pressure campaigns or business development responsibilities. The facility specialized in executive leadership transition programs and provided appropriate resources for examining complex psychological patterns while maintaining focus on strategic objectives and professional development goals. The initial phase of this self-discovery process involved comprehensive review of my personal and professional history to identify specific incidents and decision points where I had subordinated independent judgment to accommodate others' expectations or maintain relationship harmony. This historical analysis revealed consistent patterns of capability minimization and strategic deference that had been operating below conscious awareness throughout my adult life. The earliest identifiable pattern emerged during my undergraduate studies at Georgetown University, where I had demonstrated exceptional analytical capabilities in strategic communications and defense policy courses. Despite receiving recognition from professors and achieving academic distinction that warranted consideration for prestigious graduate fellowships and career development opportunities, I had consistently directed my achievements toward supporting others' objectives rather than pursuing independent professional advancement. During senior year, when Professor Davidson had recommended me for a competitive fellowship program that would have provided foundation for independent research and policy development career paths, I had declined the opportunity to focus on supporting James's military career development and our marriage planning. The decision had been rationalized through commitment to partnership and shared objectives, but the historical analysis revealed that I had systematically avoided opportunities that might have established my professional identity independently from relationship contexts. This pattern had continued throughout graduate school, where my thesis research on defense procurement processes had generated interest from government agencies and private contractors who had offered consulting opportunities and full-time positions that would have utilized my expertise for independent professional development. Yet I had consistently channeled these opportunities towards supporting James's career advancement rather than establishing my own professional trajectory and strategic positioning. The recognition that I had been avoiding independent professional identity development for over 15 years required examination of the underlying psychological frameworks that had supported these decisions. The analysis revealed deep-seated beliefs about relationship obligations and gender roles that had been internalized during childhood and reinforced through family and cultural messaging throughout my adult development. My father's expressions of pride in my academic achievements had consistently emphasized their value for supporting a future husband's career, rather than recognition of my capabilities for independent professional contribution. His guidance regarding career development had focused on acquiring skills that would enhance my effectiveness as a military spouse, rather than preparation for independent strategic leadership or business ownership responsibilities. My mother's modeling of successful marriage had demonstrated the effectiveness of strategic support roles, while providing limited examples of independent professional achievement or decision-making authority. Her satisfaction with traditional spouse responsibilities had created assumptions about optimal relationship patterns that had influenced my understanding of successful partnership and family obligations. These foundational beliefs had created psychological frameworks that interpreted independent achievement as potential threat to relationship stability, rather than enhancement of partnership value. The fear that professional success might create competition or conflict within marriage had motivated systematic minimization of capabilities and strategic deference to James's career priorities throughout our relationship development. The deeper analysis revealed that these psychological patterns extended beyond career development to encompass broader aspects of identity formation and strategic positioning within family and social relationships. The habit of subordinating personal preferences to maintain group harmony had created consistent patterns of accommodation that had prevented authentic self-expression and independent strategic development. Family gatherings throughout my adult life had involved systematic deferral to established hierarchies and communication patterns that positioned me as supportive contributor rather than equal participant in strategic discussions and decision-making processes. My insights and analytical capabilities had been valued primarily for their utility in advancing others' objectives, rather than recognition of independent strategic thinking and judgment. The psychological investment in maintaining these supportive relationships had required continuous monitoring of others' preferences and strategic adjustment of my communication and behavior to avoid conflict or disapproval. This pattern had consumed substantial emotional and intellectual energy that could have been directed toward independent professional development and strategic achievement. The recognition that I had been operating according to externally imposed expectations rather than authentic personal values required examination of my actual preferences and strategic objectives when freed from accommodation requirements. This process involved identifying aspects of my personality and capabilities that had been systematically suppressed or redirected to maintain relationship harmony and social acceptance. The analysis revealed that my natural inclination towards strategic planning and complex problem-solving had been consistently channeled towards supporting others' objectives rather than pursuing independent challenges that would have provided intellectual satisfaction and professional development. The land acquisition project represented my first sustained application of these capabilities toward independent strategic objectives, and the professional satisfaction it had provided demonstrated the extent to which my previous role limitations had prevented authentic self-expression. The introspective process also addressed the psychological functions that traditional compliance patterns had served in managing anxiety and uncertainty about independent capability and social acceptance. The security provided by established relationship roles had protected against the risks associated with independent strategic positioning and the potential isolation that might result from challenging conventional expectations. The fear of social disapproval and relationship disruption had motivated systematic avoidance of opportunities that might have established independent identity and strategic positioning. The comfort of group approval and traditional role fulfillment had provided psychological protection against the uncertainty and potential rejection that accompanies authentic self-expression and independent achievement. This psychological analysis required honest assessment of the personal costs associated with continued compliance patterns versus the risks and opportunities that would accompany authentic independence and strategic leadership development. The comparison revealed that maintaining traditional accommodation patterns would require continued suppression of capabilities and strategic interests that had become increasingly important for personal satisfaction and professional fulfillment. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.